Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see some familiar names. Excited to catch up with some of you. For those of you I don't know, my name is Michael Lippert. I'm one of the Senior Associate Directors of Admissions here at Ross, and really excited you're joining us. Tonight's topic is, a little bit of a different one in this idea of a reapplicant and what does the reapplication look like? And frankly, we know it causes a lot of anxiety and can look a little bit different. So we're really glad you're here. We want to share some of our tips, and we really appreciate your persistence and you hanging with us and showing that dedication and excitement to apply to Ross again. It's not lost on us how hard that process can be and what that feels like. And we're really excited and rooting for you this time around. So excited to dive into it. I have a wonderful admissions colleague joining me tonight who's going to help out throughout the evening. Taya, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Taya. I am the other Senior Associate Director of Admissions on the team. Really looking forward to this. I know I've been emailing with a lot of people who are thinking about reapplying, and just want to walk you through the process, and happy to share some tips tonight.
Awesome. So for the next 5 to 10 minutes or so, I and Taya are going to just share some really high level thoughts of how we would approach the reapplication process and some important logistics and tips. But then we're going to spend the bulk of the session tonight actually hearing from a couple of our awesome current students who are successful reapplicants and now here at Ross, and kind of getting their perspective on how they approached all of this. So with that, let's get into it. So what does the reapplicant process look like? Well, first things first, this is something I always get excited to tell people is the stats are in your favor. And what I mean by that is, sometimes I hear from reapplicants that they think the school may not be excited about their application, that your chances are less because you kind of have a ding against your name and you're behind the 8 ball and you have to be incredible to stand out. It doesn't really work like that. We love reapplicants at Ross. And in any given year, the stats sort of range in our class profile from at least 5% to maybe 10% of our class will be reapplicants, which is, I think, a much higher number than people realize. So there really is a lot going for you, and don't be discouraged. Next is the application fee is waived. This is something we started doing a year or so ago. We're really proud of it. I know the application fee is significant and it could be a barrier of sorts. And, that's just something we wanted to provide for all reapplicants and sort of encourage you to take another shot at this. And then Taya, I, and the rest of the team have really made this as streamlined the process as possible. I'll get into it on the next slide, but the application's really shortened and it's a pretty turnkey kind of turnaround for reapplicants. The one caveat here is if you haven't applied in the past year, so if there was a gap of a whole admission cycle since you've last applied, you will need to submit a new application. But otherwise, it's a really streamlined process. So what does that streamlined process look like? Well, first is the essays, the rec letter, and a new test score are all optional. So you are welcome to submit any of those items, but it is not a requirement of our process. And, I usually tell people not to overthink this part of it, right? And so it's not necessarily that anything was wrong with your essays the first go around. You might have had an awesome rec letter. And so those are all optional points that if you feel it would enhance your application, that's great, but certainly not required. What is required is an updated resume. We would really love to see what your resume looks like, since the last time you applied, whether that's been even 6 months or, upwards of a year or a little bit more than that. But it would be really helpful to see some of the latest projects you've worked on, if you've had any changes in your role and what that looks like. So just an updated resume, sort of the one-page upload, and then also attaching what we sort of call like the reapplication letter to that. And what we mean by that is there's no word limit or word requirement, but it's typically about a one-page letter, just letting us know what's changed since you've last applied, reiterating your interest in Ross and anything else you'd like to share with the team since you last applied. And we'll sort of combine that with your old application file. And then one thing I thought was really important to highlight quickly is our test waiver process. And so I won't spend too much time going through it, but we are offering a test waiver process for both the standardized test and the language test. And so if you applied for a test waiver last year, you're absolutely welcome to apply for a test waiver again, as you know, or use that test waiver in the process. But if you had a test score and feel like you would like a test waiver in this application, you are welcome to apply for a test waiver and go through that process. So that's something to explore if you think it might enhance your application. All right, finally, a couple of tips that I think are really important to remember. And the first of those is that self-reflection is really key. We get lots of requests for feedback or questions from reapplicants. We try to answer as many as we can. We really do. Sometimes the volume doesn't allow us to, but I will say, I truly believe that 98% of the time, if you were to ask a reapplicant, you know, what were the strengths of your application last time around? Or what were some of the points that you probably could do a little bit better, that folks get it right almost all the time. And so putting in a little bit of that self-reflection to understand, you know, what might be areas that you want to improve, you want to focus time on as you put together your reapplication. So that's something I would really spend time on right around now. I think it's a good time as you go into the process again. And this is a very similar point, but sort of not overthinking things. You know, I hear from reapplicants all the time, should I submit a new this? Or, you know, I wrote this one sentence, how did it go over? Or can I rewrite the, it's like, you can, but for the most part, those things were probably really strong. And so if you felt like you had the best recommender last go around, there's no need to switch that, right? And so really think about the things that might need improving, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel. And then the last point that I share a lot is I think there's a little bit of this misnomer that there's an expectation that reapplicants apply in round one. And that's not necessarily needed or required. If you are ready in round one and you are ready to go and it's your best application, that's great. We welcome you to apply, and that certainly makes sense. But there are other folks who might be retaking the test or about to get a promotion or about to complete a really significant work project that you're going to highlight on your resume. And it is certainly not required or even expected that reapplicants apply in round one. So don't feel any added pressure or overthink that piece of it. Taya, anything else you often share with reapplicants?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the self-reflection thing a little bit, I would say like that's actually a really valuable skill that you have the ability to highlight. Like at any given year, that ability to reflect on areas for growth and how you can improve, that's something that we really appreciate knowing about all applicants. But as a reapplicant, you actually have the chance to demonstrate that. And so thinking about your areas for growth and identifying those, I think that's actually really valuable for us to see that you were able to do that and take time to step back and do it. The other thing I would say is like focusing in on those areas for growth. I read some, 3-page essays about what they've changed before, and it's not about reaching out to 15 alums and do every little thing that you can think of that you could possibly demonstrate. A lot of times it's focusing in. Like I took on a leadership role at my job and I was able to develop these experiences and I grew in these ways. I did reach out to maybe 2 or 3 people and learned a little bit more, was able to focus my career goal and understand a little bit more what I want to get out and what the recruiting path looks like to be getting into that. So I think really thinking about how you can improve and focusing in on a couple of areas rather than, spanning the gamut and writing all kinds of writing everything you can think of can actually be really helpful to have that focus.
Awesome. Couldn't agree more. I think some really good tips there. We could share some more of our tips, but more importantly, as promised, I think it's really helpful to hear from folks who just went through the process and had to live this and were really successful in it. And folks, we're so excited to be part of our community. So as promised, we have 2 awesome students joining us tonight. Andrew, do you want to kick us off and sort of introduce, what you were doing before Ross and how you're spending your summer and where you came to Ross from?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Michael. So I'm Andrew Johnston, and prior to Ross, I was working in consulting at a company called ZS Associates in Chicago. So I was mostly focused on technology implementation work, and then came to Ross, just had an interest kind of in learning what else was out there. And I'm in the Tauber Institute program, so it's focused on operations and technology. And this summer, I've been working with Mayo Clinic focused on improving inventory operations within all their clinical labs. Was there anything else I was supposed to answer? Was that it?
No, that was perfect. I'm excited to hear more about your summer later on. That's awesome. Paul, how about you?
Yeah, so hi everybody. I'm Paul Kapp. I'm a dual degree actually between Ross and Ford, which is the public policy master's program at Michigan as well. And for my background, I worked in private sector management consulting at a firm called LEK in Boston. And then following that, worked for state government in Louisiana and DC, and mostly in education governance and program management. So my goal with coming to Michigan is to marry those two experiences and have and kind of play off each other and continuing in a public sector role that is very much informed by a private sector experience. And that kind of plays into what I'm doing this summer, where I'm working in strategy and program management for the U.S. Department of Justice here in Washington, D.C. So happy to answer any questions about that as well.
Really helpful. I remember meeting you when you were applying the public policy and telling that story, and it's so awesome to see it come together with the addition of an MBA. So excited to hear more. Good luck to both of you this summer as well as things continue on. So I see some questions rolling in the Q&A. So Tay and I are going to answer some of the admissions logistical ones as quickly as we can, and keep submitting your questions. That's exactly what you should be doing. Just to start us off, I think I was going to ask a couple of questions that I hear come up again and again, and I think would be really helpful to get Andrew and Paul's perspective on. And one is, we talked about how the reapplicant essay is one of the most important parts of this process. And it can be a little bit vague in a way in that there's no word limit. There's, a very sort of loose prompt. What were the things that you chose to highlight in that letter? How did you approach it? What tips would you give folks listening as they think about that?
Sure. So I can start. So when I was thinking about, why I didn't get in the first time, I think some of my self-reflection was perhaps what I wanted to do was a little unclear in my application. So just really doubling down on what my position at Ross, or what kind of person I would be, and make it clear that admissions would be oh, this is a person that fits into Tauber. So I think that was helpful. I really wrote about that in my application the second time, whereas the first time I was well, I liked consulting before, and maybe I want to do tech, and it was probably a little too all over the place. Maybe not that bad, right? But really hone in on as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson said, know your role. Make sure that you know exactly what you're doing, and not only what it is, but explain that to admissions and how you would fit into Ross. What is the Ross equivalent of that thing you want to do?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Andrew. I think as part of the reapplication process, I think I spent probably the greatest amount of emphasis on the reapplicant letter. I would definitely emphasize that because it is something that is completely new and born out of reflection. So it is something that, if you can think of it some way, almost something that you learn from your first time around and have an advantage over someone applying for the first time, because you get to show a new side of yourself. So I definitely, kind of similar to what Andrew said, I think I was lucky enough to meet with Michael and talk a little bit about it during the reapplicant process, and kind of something he highlighted for me is maybe being more focused and giving more thought to how the Ross degree will help you get to where you need to go. Because if you've made it this far, you're probably you're doing well enough to, you'll be able to thrive at Ross, but do you really know where you want to take it? And that's really what the reapplicant essay, or at least how I approached it, and everybody's path is a little bit different, but was really, what am I still missing what will I both provide to the Ross community, and what can I only get from Ross to be able to get to where I want to go? And because there's no prompt or anything, that the reapplicant essay is the greatest way to do that. And in fact, I think that it gives you a little bit more space to do that than you had maybe the first round, and when there's a specific essay question, when you really have that more promptless reapplicant letter, you're able to really delve into what makes you unique and how your goals are really both concrete and attainable with the Ross degree.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think a theme I'm hearing from both of you, and that as I think about applications that I'm reading over the years, that is really true of successful reapplicants, especially if you have a pretty specific career goal, is really sort of honing in on, how you've thought about that career goal and the work you've done to prepare for recruiting. And you get the sense from reapplicants pretty often that A, they're ready to hit the ground running, which is awesome and always impressive to the admissions team. And B, that they've really visualized themselves at Ross. And so, it's not like we're asking why Ross, but there's almost a sense of if you're applying to Ross the second time, you really want to be here. And that's great. And that's an asset to you in the application process, right? Like we want people who want to be at Ross. And so highlighting some of those and showing us how you visualize that is really compelling to the admissions team. So that's awesome advice. I think something we can definitely think about for folks as they start writing those essays. I'll ask one more question, then we'll get to some of the good ones in the Q&A. We talked about self-reflection, and so not to be coy, but self-reflection probably also involves getting some good advice from key members in your group, right? Whether it be family and friends or alums you connected with. How did you guys approach the reflection process and figure out what you wanted to emphasize? And were there particular people you talked to who were really helpful in that?
Sure, I can go again. So I connected, with people close to me, I guess, first. So I talked to my girlfriend and was like, man, I didn't get into this Ross program. Like, what the heck? So we went through my essay and she's like, yeah, maybe you should have ran this through me the first time. So I definitely think family and like people close to you can really help find your voice. But then it's really important to know, again, like how many kind of positions there are open in Ross. And I know that it's never like quite clear, but my understanding is that they're looking to fill a class. So they don't want to fill everyone who wants to go into consulting. They want people who also are interested in tech and nonprofit and these other areas. So like kind of getting a good understanding of like what Ross offers. And you can get that by talking to admissions. You can get that by talking to current students, alumni, right? Just people in your professional network. So I'd say there's no necessarily people I wouldn't recommend talking to. Sometimes it's good just to get a broad perspective.
Yes, I kind of think of both of especially if there's anyone that you engaged with during the first time of the process. I went back to people that I had talked to when I was first even exploring applying to Ross the first time. They usually had pretty good feedback on that, as well as anybody that you've connected with on the admissions team. Again, that I remember conversations I had with Michael that were really helpful for me to rethink through what I might need to emphasize a little bit more during the reapplicant process, or where I actually might focus my reflection on. And then I would say again that recognizing that there's no one, you're not trying to find like an answer for how to get in. It's more that figure out kind of more defined what your pathway is, and then try to reach out to or have people that you have talked to maybe recommend you to other classmates they have that are living that path. And then they are usually the ones, for instance, during my reapplication, I was applying again as a dual degree student. So most of the advice I sought out for my journey was seeking out that subset community within Ross that was pursuing that similar path. And they were able to provide the kind, or at least ask me the kind of questions of, well, why do you need both? How do they complement each other? How have you really thought through that? And how can you maybe think through why they're both, and able to provide a little bit more context there. So a little bit long-winded, but I guess to summarize is like a little bit of self-reflection to kind of narrow down who to talk to, but then seeking, again, those that are following a similar path, because they usually have the, whatever that might be, whether it's Zell Lurie or Herb or any kind of the other career paths you want to follow, but seeking out the people that are doing that currently at the school.
Awesome, good advice there. There's a few logistical admissions questions here, so I guess we'll shift gears for a few minutes. Taya, I touched on the test waiver a little bit. There's a question here about if you had a test waiver last time, is that still applicable, or do I have to reapply for a new test waiver?
Yeah, so that part isn't streamlined. You do need to reapply for a new test waiver, and the test waiver application should be opening around the same time as our application for admission. So both, hopefully within this next week here or so, we'll be sending an email announcement about that when it's ready. But there's not a lot of changes to the test waiver application, but there's a couple of changes, slight changes to it. One is there's additional required documents with transcripts and asking a few slightly different questions. So we want to make sure we're evaluating everyone on the same playing field. So you would need to resubmit it, but it's a fairly similar process.
Awesome. I will answer a question here about adding an additional recommendation as opposed to changing an old one. And so I think a couple of things to note here. We as a team have given a lot of thought to the fact that we only require one recommendation because we feel pretty strongly that one recommendation is really all we need from that piece of the application to understand sort of who you are in the workplace and some of your strengths. And so we often get asked by any applicant, whether you're a reapplicant or not, if a second recommendation letter would be helpful. And the answer there is it's not something that we put any significant weight on. We really don't encourage it. If a second recommendation is submitted, it does get added to your file. It's like one of those, I see it, but we just don't put all that much weight on it. And I really discourage people from asking supervisors or senior folks to spend time on it because it's just not a great use of their time and it won't make that much of a difference in the process. One big caveat to that, I think, for reapplicants is to say, if you choose this year to include another recommendation as part of your application, particularly a recommender who might highlight things you've worked on in the past year and how important some of that work was and the value you've added in the past year, that strategically can add a lot of value to your application and really stand out. And so that's kind of doing so in a really thoughtful way and can add value. It is certainly not required. We're not expecting it, but that might be something, particularly, I think, if you have a recommender who can speak to things you've done in the past year, that might be something you want to look at and add to your application. Teo, what about, or this is a pretty simple question. I guess I can answer it quickly, but we do require interviews of any, even if you interview that cycle, you will need to interview again. We give you that opportunity. It's actually a great opportunity, I think, to enhance your application, but that part of, you would go through that part of the process again. Let's see. I'll answer Sophia's question here about the length of your resume. There is no requirement that a resume in the MBA application process is one page. It is always highly recommended, and it's sort of seen as a best practice often. And it's what career services will coach the vast majority of our MBA students to do. So it's not necessarily a requirement. I guess one recommendation or piece of advice I would give here is that you can sort of shorten maybe some of the bullet points from past roles and sort of highlight some of your what you're doing in your newest roles. And also to some extent, you can probably highlight some things that might sound like a helpful bullet point and highlight some of those in your reapplication essay. I promise you, we read every word of that and multiple people are reading it. So it won't get lost in the process. And it's probably okay if maybe one bullet's missing from your resume to keep it at one page. So hopefully that's helpful. Let's see. Noah has a question here, Taya, about any advice for folks who were admitted last year, but either weren't able to obtain a deferral or just chose to not attend because of a work-related reason or other things in life.
Yeah, I mean, so you were admitted, so chances are that you have a fairly strong application. But you do need to keep in mind you're being evaluated against a whole new application pool. So there's no guarantees you're going to be admitted again. So I might think a little bit about, being clear about the why now and what your career goals and why this year is more valuable for addressing in your reapplicant essay. This is why I chose not to come initially and why I think that this is the better year for me to be coming. So I might focus a little bit on the why now if you were admitted and decided not to come a little bit more than before. But otherwise, I would say similar advice to the other reapplicants is continuing to think about how you can strengthen your application. Even though you were admitted the previous year, it never hurts to do that self-reflection and improve where you can.
Yeah. there was a question here for Andrew, and I'm not seeing it now. So I'll have to come back to that because I wanted to ask that.
Yeah, I answered it, but I can
okay.
I can answer it and verbally as well.
Please do. I don't even remember what it was, but go ahead.
So it was asking about like what I highlighted talking about Tauber the second time, and you know, how it was a bit of a career change. So I just put 3 things on there. So the first was just researching kind of career paths from Tauber students. So like being able to talk about realistically, like this is what I want to do post MBA, and have it be like something that the admissions team would be like, oh yeah, I've seen Tauber students do that in the past. So that seems like a realistic actual path you could take. The second thing was highlighting any like similarities you might have to the program or things that might make you stand out. So like I have an industrial engineering undergrad. I hadn't done any like engineering work since my undergrad. I had mostly been doing like tech consulting, but it was like, oh yeah, I know about Six Sigma and stuff like that. Like I just kind of highlighted any relevant experience that I might have had and kind of highlighted that. And then finally, I talked to current students in Tauber to learn like what kind of classes that they enjoy and like what they like doing. And then did some research on my own about those courses. And then I just made sure to highlight like, oh, and I really think this class would be a reason that I could really contribute because I have some experience and I would like help my classmates learn about this new ops area. Or I might say, oh, I don't know anything about this, but I'm really excited about learning about this product design course that Tauber students do. So just like figuring out a way to know where I'm going and like clearly articulate that, and also like along the journey talk about the things I'm excited about while I'm at Ross, and not only like what I want to do, but also how I might be able to give back to the cohort by saying like, and I have some engineering background, so maybe I can like help people understand some of the more quant stuff that you have to do in business school. So just highlighting, like, I know that was a little bit of a tangent, but like hopefully that makes sense. Like highlighting like where you want to go, highlighting the things that you can give to your cohort, and also the things that like you're excited about, and like use the proper Ross language to say like this course number or this club or things like that.
Awesome. I'll ask this one to everybody. I guess I have a couple of thoughts maybe too, but there's been a couple of questions, and I think it's a good question to ask, to say, if I applied in a later round, or just in general, I've been sending waitlist updates. You know, I was on the waitlist up until June or July, and now I'm applying again in September. It doesn't feel like all that much is, you know, significantly different. So how do I position some of that? You know, Andrew, you and I were sort of chatting about this right before this started a little bit, but you know, I guess I'll start us off in that. One thing is, we don't expect you to put forth a radically different application. We don't expect you to have gotten promoted twice in the last year, right? Like there aren't unreasonable expectations here. And so I wouldn't put all of that pressure and anxiety on yourself to make things that much different. But Paul, Andrew, any thoughts on, like, you know, if you haven't had any dramatic career switches, some of the things you want to talk about or think about?
I think again, maybe that I guess my instinct there would be, and then maybe if you don't have as many changes on your resume because you're still in the same role, though, or maybe you might want to still recover something you've submitted in I guess I won't guess there about maybe something you've submitted in a waitlist update, but in general, something that might just not be in an update because it's not career change related, but maybe just in the reapplicant essay again, showing more of the, maybe emphasizing more of the reflection piece and a lot more about the goals for the future, because just because you've been keeping kind of in touch over what has happened now doesn't mean you could still use more space to have more thought and reflection about what you want to do in the future and how you want to fit into the Ross community. So that might be my advice on that, is to maybe then spend a little bit more time on the reflection piece.
Yeah, it also sounds like this cycle was particularly challenging just to even get interviews and get in front of people. So, I mean, a lot of people that didn't get admitted could be at no fault of your own. I mean, just getting your story out there, I think, is important. So I think they said earlier that like 10% of people are reapplicants. So if you think about a class of 400 people and there's 64 attendees on here, that's pretty good odds, right? 10%. So it's like two-thirds of the people on the call, right? If you're the only folks that reapply. So I don't know, seems pretty good. I would maybe think about how to frame discussions, not about like calling Michael and being like, hey, Michael, how do I get in next year? But maybe framing them as like, hey, I'm really interested in this career path, and I wanted to talk to you about like the ways that, you know, I could think about using a Ross or like going to Ross and how Ross might help me do that. And kind of, I don't know if Michael will offer this, so I'm kind of throwing him out there, but like, or maybe current students, right? If you want to say, someone at Ross help me figure out how I could get to this thing and like what my path might look like, just having a better life plan for the next, like how you'd spend the 2 years is, I think, or 3 years in some cases, like is really beneficial to have that a little tighter, because once you get here, there's a lot happening, and it could be challenging if you're just kind of jumping at every opportunity. So it is good to have a little bit of a structure to your plan.
Yeah, I love the operations approach to the percentages there, Andrew. That's really good. But in all seriousness, I love that you brought that up. And so I think I saw a question about this, and so it's a perfect segue to address it. Generally speaking, it's really hard, especially at peak times of the year, for the admissions committee to offer one-to-one feedback sessions with all reapplicants. We might be able to at some points of the year or try to respond to things, but it's really hard to offer sessions to everybody who's looking for one. On the flip side, if you're asking really thoughtful questions or very specific points of your application, and you've shown to us that you've thought about your application and really reflected on it and have some very specific questions, I respond to those all the time, and I love doing that. And so I think putting in the effort on the front end and thinking about what are some of the key questions, as opposed to just like, I'd like to get some feedback. Because the first thing I would say in a feedback session, if I'm able to connect with you, is what do you think some of the strengths and weaknesses were from your application? And like, give me a sense of where have you been thinking about it in the process. So I think that's a really awesome point, Andrew. I'm glad you brought it up. Taya, I'm seeing a couple of questions about consortium application. It is a specifically different process, and not to become a tangent, but there's a few in the Q&A here. Do you want to quickly touch on that?
Yeah, I see a couple questions about it. So there's kind of two different scenarios. If you applied through the consortium the first time and you're reapplying to Ross, the first scenario is if you want to apply through the consortium again. You certainly can do that, but not all schools have the streamlined process that Ross has. So you would still need to do all of the normal requirements for the consortium application. You could certainly still reuse the supplemental essays that are Ross specific, because our essay prompts are the same as last year. So that would be the one part that could be streamlined, but otherwise you would do the consortium application just like normal. Now, if you applied to the consortium last year and want to apply just to Ross this year individually, that you can do the streamlined process. So you just check the box that say, yes, I applied to Ross last year, and that will automatically, exempt you from some of the normal requirements. Say you can have the application fee waived and the other optional items with the essays and the recommendations. So you kind of have two paths to follow, and it kind of just depends if you plan on reapplying to multiple consortium schools or just applying to Ross or maybe a couple other non-consortium schools. You just got to pick the route that you want to take.
Awesome, super helpful. I will take this one. Ming asked, when you're reapplying, how is the previous application package used in the evaluation, and how much does it matter? And so I'll try to answer this as directly as possible. We all probably read applications slightly differently, but generally speaking, we're going to look at your old application and see essentially anything from your old application that you're repeating as part of the streamlined process. And frankly, that's going to be a significant amount of it. We're going to look at as part, it sort of will repopulate almost as a new application. Like, we will think of it as this year's application. Things that are new to your application. So think your updated resume or the new letter you submitted, we're going to look at those pretty much solely. I mean, we might peek at your old resume or think about, but we will essentially look at the most updated materials that you have submitted, and those will weigh far more heavily than things you submitted the past time, assuming you've uploaded an update to those or adjusted them. So another example is if you chose to answer the essays differently, we're going to pay far more attention to your new answers from this year than the old ones from the past year. A reader might read what you've shared in the past, but it won't have nearly as much weight as some of the new materials. So something to think about there. We have a couple more minutes left here. I think we've done a good job answering most of the questions. Taya, there's a question here about interviews, what it'll look like this year. It's a hot topic. We're talking about it a lot. You know, it talks about the group interview. So I think we can talk about that a little bit. You know, that might seem a little bit different right now.
Yeah, so we are still planning on our interviews being completely virtual this fall. And with that, last year we added, well, some of you might have participated in it, but we had a different component to the interview day, which was an interview day welcome, where we integrated some of the components of the team exercise that I think were most popular, where you got to meet other candidates and hear from our current students and do a lot of those. So we still had that virtually, and we will be planning something fairly similar this fall for those that are interviewing as well, but it will be a virtual experience. Awesome.
Patrick's question is a good one, and it reminds me of something else I want to share. So let's spend a minute on this. If you had, I think we briefly referenced this earlier in the conversation tonight, but if you do submit a sort of second additional letter from an alum or even a current student, if that's part of your file, will that carry over? And it does. It sort of attaches to your file. Again, we certainly don't encourage them. They really don't have a significant impact, but if it was there in the past, it'll be there again. And so no need to resubmit that. This does remind me, because this is a little bit of a different answer, but for those of you who were on the wait list this spring or summer, or even, you know, possibly still on the wait list and going through that process, we realize we've asked you for some significant updates about what your spring and summer have looked like, your interest in Ross, and those have been really helpful updates. We've read them as part of our waitlist process at this point, but those don't always connect in verbatim to where they were in the spring to your new application. And so, you know, if somebody, like, I recognize some of your names in the chat right now and some of your stories, and so in some cases we'll remember it, but I would really not assume that waitlist updates I've shared and some of that context is necessarily attached to my new application. And so the point being, if that's something that applies to you, I would think about how to take pieces of my waitlist update and build them into my reapplication letter to ensure that the entire admissions committee sees that as part of your application. So that's something I would definitely give some thought to. We're doing pretty good here on questions. We'll do one or two more here. You know, Tangshu, I think your question sort of gets to this idea of what happens if not all that much has changed over time, and how to share some of that, especially during COVID. You know, I think COVID's an interesting time for everybody. And it also goes to this idea of, you know, we don't expect radically different applications. So don't worry if it's, you know, that you don't feel like anything significant has changed, but just sort of build upon, I think, some of the important parts that you have, and then share some of the pieces you've reflected on that are the strengths of your application as well. Let's see. Oh, Alexandra, that's a good question. And so the application is expected to open almost any day now. I would say, you know, by the end of the month for sure. It's coming really soon. It's a good question. I realize wanting
days,
to get,
not weeks.
yeah, wanting to get started. You know, I'm underselling it. It's probably real soon. Let's see. Oh, Kastab, I see your question about other MBA programs at Ross. I think Teo is answering this. You know, this is sort of focused on the full-time program. If you're having trouble getting connected to the any other programs admissions team, we're always happy to make an introduction. But a lot of what's being shared today is probably specific to the full-time program. There's probably some general tips that are applicable to all, but I definitely want to learn specific. Each program probably has a different reapplication process. So I will stop there. Andrew, Paul, any last words of advice or encouragement for folks?
No, just everyone reapply, and persistence pays off. And I think it's cool that Taya and Michael are throwing this webinar to begin with. I don't know how many business schools are doing this for reapplicants, but I do think it shows that, you know, that they were definitely impressed with a lot of your applications, and you should just reapply, and I'm sure it'll turn out better next time. It did for me, at least. So, you know, N of 1, there you go.
Yeah, I think if you're on this call, it means you're already doing the right thing in terms of being persistent and letting things roll off you. And I mean, kind of something to think about too is once you get to Ross, the recruiting process is also going to involve a lot of ups and downs. So kind of take this as a learning experience of being able to not take it too personally, and being able to jump right back up there and try again, because it doesn't stop once you get into Ross. That's kind of continues then right around when you turn to recruiting too. So I think take these lessons with you moving forward. And again, the fact that you're on this call means you already have that mindset. And so focus on that strength and continue with it.
Awesome. Well, Andrew and Paul, thank you so much for your time. I know you guys are busy with your internships. Good luck the rest of the summer. And just a reminder to everybody, stay positive through all of this. This is an anxiety-inducing process, and I realize it sort of feels like you've been beaten up once, but trust me, we're rooting for you. We want to see you succeed, and you know what the process is like, especially as you've gone through it. So there are a lot of things going in your favor. We're excited to read your applications again, and we have a lot of events throughout the year, in general. And so we, definitely keep learning about Ross. I think, seeing folks how strongly they feel about the program and wanting to be here is always, really stands out in the reapplication process. So good luck to everybody. Keep an eye out for that application opening soon, and we'll talk to you soon. Go Blue.
Go Blue.